Hi guys, today we're going to take a look at an old topic, namely solving quadratic equations using multiple methods. Now, as a reminder, quadratic equations were a big part of Algebra 1. They're also going to be a big part of Algebra 2 next year. Hence why we want to make sure that you guys have a good foundation before we send you off to hopefully what's a better class in geometry. All right, so first things first, guys. Quadratic, in terms of what it looks like, all right, we're not going to talk about that so much right now, but just so you guys get an image from last year, quadratics, when they're graphed, they form parabolas. So quadratic equations, if they're graphed, form parabolas. Now, the way to recognize a quadratic equation is pretty simple. The highest exponent is going to be 2. Right? So if I had something, just making them off the top of my head, like y equals x squared plus 5x plus 1 or something like that, we know that's a quadratic equation because the highest power is 2. In Algebra 2, you guys are going to go on and learn that if it has a highest exponent of 3, it's going to be a cubic. If it has a highest exponent of 4, it's going to be a quartic. But for right now, we're going to just stick with the quadratics for a moment, or a few moments, and make sure that you guys know how to deal with them. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna review 3 major methods to solve quadratic equations. There are actually 5 different methods, but 2 of them we're not really gonna focus on here. We're not gonna focus so much on graphing because it's very time consuming. And we're not gonna focus so much on solving using square roots because it doesn't show up all that often, and if it does show up, it's like so easy. It's almost like just solving a regular old linear equation, only with having to take the square root of both sides. So the methods that we're going to focus on for right now are going to be factoring, completing the square, and quadratic formula. Let me say that again. The 3 methods we're going to review are factoring, completing the square, and quadratic formula. So the way we're going to do this, guys, is we're actually going to take a problem. We're going to take problem number 17 on the solving quadratic equations practice, and we're actually going to solve it all 3 ways. Let's go. So number 17 says this: x squared, I believe it's minus 6x plus 8 equals 0. So before you can solve a quadratic, guys, normally it is a good idea to make sure that there's an equal 0 on the other side. Basically, you want everything on one side and 0 on the other. Now, let's say we're going to try to solve this. We're going to call this method number 1. We're going to solve this by using factoring. Okay. So to solve this by using factoring, here's what I need to do. I need to figure out what are 2 numbers that multiply to give me positive 8, but add to give me negative 6. Multiply to give me positive 8, but add to give me negative 6. So I know 4 times 2 is 8, but 4 plus 2 would be positive 6. Oh, so I could actually use minus 2 and minus 4, because negative 2 times negative 4 is positive 8, but negative 2 plus negative 4 is negative 6. So when I factor it, guys, I end up with 2 pair of parentheses. Then, using zero product property, right? Zero product property from Algebra 1, what we do is we set each parenthesis equal to 0. So I'm going to say x minus 2 equals 0, x minus 4 equals 0, add 2 to both sides, add 4 to both sides, and I get that my 2 solutions, guys, are 2 and 4. Isn't that nice? So factoring is actually a pretty easy method to use. However, it has one fatal weakness, and that's that not every quadratic can be solved using factoring. So it's nice if it works, but sometimes it doesn't. So you might end up being really, really sad if you sit there for like, 20 minutes trying to factor the thing and it turns out it's not factorable. So let's take a look at another method that works really well. The second method we're going to take a look at is completing the square. Completing the square. Now, we've actually done this in geometry, right? We've done this in geometry when we're talking about circle equations. Now, in algebra, it has a slightly different purpose, which is to solve a quadratic equation, but let's not let that deter us. Okay, so I'm going to write down my original equation one more time. X squared minus 6x plus 8 equals 0. Now, for completing the square, you want the x squared and the x's on the left, but you're going to want to move your constant, just like the plain old number, to the right-hand side. So let me do that now. Okay? So that's what I'm going to end up with. Then, just like we learned in geometry, we're going to use our formula, b over 2 squared, to figure out what we have to add to both sides. So my b value here is -6. So -6 over 2, let's see, that's -3. And -3 squared is +9. So what that means, guys, is I'm going to add 9 to both sides. Now over here, this is actually pretty simple, right? -8 plus 9 is +1. Over here, I'm going to have to factor, okay? So what two numbers multiply to give me +9, but add to give me -6? Well, 3 times 3 is 9, but 3 plus 3 is +6. Oh, so it's going to have to be -3 and -3, or I could write it as x minus 3 squared. So this is where you may have stopped on the Algebra 1 EOC, for those of you guys who took it. But when you solve an equation using completing the square, you have to get rid of the square. So how do I undo a square? I take the square root. So what I do is I square root both sides. Okay? Square root both sides. And so here's what I end up with. X minus 3 equals plus minus 1. Why plus minus? Because there are two different possibilities, right? 1 times 1 equals 1, or -1 times -1 equals 1. And then what I'm going to do is add 3 to both sides. So 3 plus or minus 1. In order to actually figure, in order to actually figure that out, well, let's do the plus first. What's 3 plus 1? 4. And what's 3 minus 1? 2. Oh my gosh. Are those the same answers that I got from factoring? Why? Yes, they are. Okay, so this happened to work pretty well, but I want you to notice something about why it worked well. The reason it worked well, guys, is because this number right here, the b value, it happened to be even. If it's not even, you probably don't want to use completing the square because it's not going to end very well for you. You're going to end up with fractions all over the place. All right? And now, last but not least, let's take a look at one last method. And this is the quadratic formula. Okay? This is the quadratic formula. Now, the quadratic formula is quadratic formula is super awesome if you remember it. So I'm going to write it here. -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Oh my god, what a mouthful, right? But if you guys can remember that a is the number in front of the x squared, the b is the number in front of the x, and the c is the number at the very end. All it is a giant game of plug in. So let's actually go ahead and do that. So b is -6, so -6 is going to be a +6. All right, -6 squared is going to be +36. And then -4 times 1 times 8 all over 2 times 1. Again, how did I know a was 1? Well, because it's just a 1 in front of the x squared. All right, and c is the value at the end. So now, 4 times 1 times 8 is 32. And 36 minus 32 happens to be what, 4? Okay, what's rad 4? Oh my gosh, it happens to be 2. So let's actually do the plus first. 6 plus 2 is 8. 8 over 2 is 4. Now let's do that minus. 6 minus 2 is 4, and 4 over 2 is 2. So guys, here's what we got. Using all three methods, we were able to get exactly the same answer. Now, the problem for you is going to be choosing which method or which methods you go with. So here's what I'm going to say. For most people, factoring is the easiest method, okay? The problem with factoring is that it doesn't always work. So there are going to be some cases where it's not an option. Completing the square will always work, all right? It's one of the two methods that does always work, but its problem is it only works well and nicely if this number right here, the b value, is even. The quadratic formula always works, but it's time consuming. So I would say quadratic formula, if you're going to use it, make sure you have enough time in order to be able to go through meticulously and avoid making any careless mistakes with negatives.